Well, it's time to talk about the causes and effects of slavery in the British colonies. And it's certainly not a fun one to talk about, but you gotta know it nonetheless. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, now when you think about the geographical concentration of slavery during the colonial period, I'm guessing that little map inside your brain zooms into the South and the Caribbean. And that is not a bad instinct, my dear pupil, but it's certainly not the whole story. The fact is, slavery was present in all the British colonies of the Americas on account of the terrific demand for labor that produced colonial goods for export. And it was those goods that brought in embarrassing amounts of wealth for the British crown. And hey, monarchs like Charles II needed that money because, as you may or may not know, his gaggle of illegitimate children weren't going to support themselves. Oh, by the way, if you want Noteguides to follow along with this video and all my videos along with quizzes to help you remember it all, then check that link in the description. Anyway, the point is, here are all the British colonies in North America, and all of them relied on slavery to some extent. However, there is a spatial pattern to slavery that's pretty easy to remember. Start here in the north and you have the fewest amount of enslaved people, and then the further you move south, the more these societies relied upon enslaved labor. So up here in New England, recall that it was mostly made up of small family farms, since that was really all that they could muster given the rocky soil and the colder climate. Therefore, while some enslaved Africans were imported to this region, it was very little by comparison. And then in the middle colonies, there were slightly more enslaved Africans, and they were concentrated mostly in port cities like New York and New Jersey, where they worked in the docks. Additionally, many of the other enslaved Africans in this region worked in households, and still others worked in large grain plantations located in the Hudson River Valley. But then as we start to move into the Chesapeake region, the amount of enslaved Africans begins to spike rapidly. Since we're getting into a region where the climate is warmer and the growing seasons are longer, that meant that this region was dominated by large-scale plantations that exported, among other things, high-demand crops like tobacco. And it's the same story as we move south through the Carolinas and end up in the British West Indies, the latter of which held by far the largest concentration of enslaved Africans on account of their deep reliance on sugar cultivation. And by the time we get down here, the black population outnumbered the white population 4-1, a reality that started to make the white planters more than a little twitchy. And so what they did about their twitchiness was to ensure that they could control the enslaved black population. And they did that by creating a new definition of slavery, as well as imposing new laws that aimed to keep the racial hierarchy intact. Now, as for the new definition, chattel slavery became the dominant form of coerced labor in the British colonies. Essentially, the word chattel means property, and so the idea is that enslaved people were now the complete and perpetual property of the slaveholder. Additionally, as I mentioned in a previous video, planters in the Caribbean adopted the Barbados Slave Code, which stripped all rights from enslaved blacks and granted white planters complete power over them, which led to brutal and vicious punishments for the enslaved. And eventually, those codes were also adopted in the southern colonies as slavery became even more prominent. And finally, other laws were passed stating that if an enslaved woman bore a child, then that child would also be perpetually enslaved. And from there, similar law codes were adopted in other colonies as well. Okay, now here's where I tell you that although enslaved Africans constituted the main source of labor in the British colonies, by the end of this period, it wasn't like that in the beginning. In fact, at the beginning of this period, the bulk of the labor done in the colonies was performed by indentured servants. And if that sounds like work was done by servants with a fresh set of false teeth, well then, no, that's not what they were. No, an indenture was basically a contract, and so an indentured servant was a person who was contracted to work for a certain period of time in order to pay off a debt. And in our case, that debt was the cost of migrating from Great Britain to the colonies. So for example, some guy in Britain decides that he wants to relocate to Virginia for work, but as it turns out, he's so poor that when he goes to the local pond, the ducks throw him food. So ain't no way he can afford passage to America. But if he signed an indenture, then the trip would be paid for so long as he was willing to work without wages in the New World for 7 years in order to pay off that debt, after which he'd go free. And as it turns out, this arrangement was pretty attractive to a lot of men who migrated to the American colonies. And it's going to be important for you to know that at this point, both black and white workers were indentured servants. However, around the middle of the 17th century, the race line would begin to thicken significantly. For example, in 1640, a black indentured servant named John Punch ran away from his plantation along with 2 white indentured servants. And when they were captured, the white men received 4 more years on their indenture, but Punch was condemned to lifelong slavery. So this event signaled a significant shift toward race-based slavery in Virginia and throughout the rest of the colonies. Anyway, one of the chief reasons indentured servitude was attractive was because at the end of the contract, the worker would receive a plot of land that they could work for themselves. But in the second half of the 17th century, this system began to break down in Virginia since the land available to freed indentured servants was becoming far more scarce. And as it turned out, when you worked for 7 years in order to get your own plot of land and there isn't much left, well, that would make anybody a little saucy. So a group of these disgruntled indentured servants started causing some trouble, and in response, Virginia's Governor William Berkeley led the legislature to revoke these men's voting rights. And as a result, a group of these disenfranchised farmers led by Nathaniel Bacon erupted in fighting. Now, a significant part of their beef with Berkeley was that they felt he was favoring the Virginia elite and refusing to help farmers on the frontier attack indigenous people in order to expand their land holdings. So first they attacked American Indian settlements, and then they came for Berkeley himself, who courageously fled like a chump. Now, there were lots of twists and turns, but in the end, Bacon got sick and died, and that gave Berkeley the opportunity to crush the rebellion, which he did swiftly. And the whole reason I'm telling you this story is because this one event, perhaps more than any other in this period, led to a dramatic shift in the labor systems in the American colonies. Now, prior to this, there were definitely enslaved Africans in the colonies, but most of the work in the Chesapeake region was carried out by indentured servants. But this rebellion made wealthy Southern planters clutch their pearls because they feared other groups of disgruntled indentured servants inciting even more rebellions. And of special importance here was the fact that both free and enslaved black people participated in Bacon's rebellion. There was really no color line here in this event. The only thing that these rebels had in common was that they were poor and disgruntled. And so the slave codes and the various race-based laws that I mentioned earlier had an added benefit for wealthy planters, namely that black people were now considered to be less than white people of any level of wealth. And that helped ensure that poor whites and blacks would be unlikely to unite again in rebellion, since even the poorest of whites could hold on to the belief that at least they were better than someone. Anyway, from this point on, planters began to demand more and more enslaved Africans, which, as I mentioned, would become the dominant labor system in the South. Now, I confess it's a little weird that I even have to say this, but enslaved Africans who were made to endure the brutality of this system did not enjoy or even appreciate being enslaved. But I do have to say, because there's this persistent misunderstanding that many, if not all, enslaved laborers were content with their lot in life, especially if they had the good fortune to labor for that mythical good master. But as we say here in the South, that dog won't hunt. No, all you have to do is look at the abundance of newspaper ads announcing the escape of enslaved people during that era, and it's clear that these enslaved laborers were not in the least content with their situation. But even more than that, we have several examples of slave resistance, which is an equally important part of this whole story. The first way they resisted this brutal system was through covert means, which is to say these acts were smaller and more secretive. For example, enslaved people attempted to maintain their family structures in secret even though they were under the constant threat of separation if a planter decided to sell one or the other members of the family. Or sometimes they worked slower or broke tools, both of which were ways to hinder the progress of the plantation, even if only subtly. Additionally, many enslaved Africans worked hard to resist the dehumanizing effects of slavery by maintaining cultural elements that they carried from their ancestral home, things like gender roles and religious beliefs and their own traditional languages out of the hearing of their white masters. Additionally, they introduced musical instruments like drums and the banjo to the Americas. And by blending African, European, and indigenous traditions, they created syncretic cultures that resulted in foods like gumbo and jambalaya and traditions like Mardi Gras. And while covert resistance was much more widespread among the entire enslaved population, it was overt resistance which had a much bigger impact. Now, the first slave rebellion in the 18th century occurred in New York City. A group of enslaved people intentionally burned down a building at the edge of town, and as white folks came rushing to see what was going on, rebels killed 9 of them. Now, those rebels were pretty quickly captured and tortured and publicly burned in the town square, but it was a sure signal that these enslaved workers were fed up with the ravages of slavery. And then down in Jamaica, which was a major cash cow for Britain owing to its prodigious exports of sugar, another rebellion broke out. Here the resistance was led by fugitive slaves who lived in what were known as maroon societies, and they basically waged war against British planters for more than a decade until finally the British signed a treaty recognizing their freedom in 1740. And then the most famous of all slave rebellions in the 13 colonies was known as the Stono Rebellion, which occurred in South Carolina in 1739. Basically, a small group of recently arrived enslaved people to South Carolina gathered by the Stono River and launched an attack throughout the region. And the further they marched, the more numbers they gained until the rebels were about 100 strong. And they killed any white people that they came across and burned their houses and barns as well. Now, eventually the South Carolina militia met the rebels in battle and quickly defeated them. But what's most important to remember about this rebellion and the numerous other rebellions that occurred around the same time is this. The chief effect of slave rebellions was to drive fear deep into the hearts of Southern planters that their own enslaved people would revolt. Therefore, South Carolina's slave codes were made even more severe in order to suppress any future rebellions. All of which is to say the institution of slavery became even more entrenched in the Southern colonies and even more brutal toward those who were made to endure it. Okay, you can click here to watch my other Unit 2 videos, or you can click here to grab my video note guides, which are going to help you get all the content of this course firmly crammed into your brain folds. And I appreciate you coming around, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.